The daily code snippet. We will now look at an example of using the background image property. We are taking some code from a previous example where we showed how to wrap text around photographs within an article. But instead of the full width container image we had for that, we will load a background image into our body, then our first section will overlap that image. Let's take a look. Now let's look at the HTML. Most of this code is the placeholder text for our article. Since this page only has a single article, we have removed any navigation from the header and only have a single section. Here is our CSS. We are loading the background image into the body. Because we only want the image to display once at the top, we have set the background repeat to no repeat. If the image doesn't load, we would just want a white background. We will only focus on the CSS that is relevant to our exercise. Our container that has our content is set to 80% the browser width and is centered. By setting the height to 300 pixels, it allows the first section to overlap. Finally, our first section will also have a background color that is white to separate it from the background. By adding the padding, it gives us some space between the edges and the text in the section that overlaps. What would happen if we have a repeating image? The key change we would make is in our CSS. We will change the background repeat to repeat. This is the result. The image will repeat horizontally and vertically. Since our image spans the full width, it repeats vertically. Now let's look at an example with more than one image loaded as a background image. We have made no changes to the HTML, but here's the CSS. We are loading two new images, one of a palmetto and the other of a water background with a turtle. Neither image will repeat. We add the background color as a backup. This is how it would display. And finally, here is the CSS to repeat one of the images, the palmetto. And here is the result. From a design perspective, you would never do this. It is simply to illustrate the function of the code. Even loading more than one image is probably something you would only do occasionally, as it is difficult to visually work with two images loading into the same element and have them go together well, especially with responsive design. The technique has been used where one of the images creates a textured background and the repeating element creates a pattern as an overlay. But again, it is not likely something you would see on modern websites. There are other possible values for background image. None is the default. No background image will be displayed. Linear gradient sets a linear gradient from top to bottom if at least two colors are defined. Repeating linear gradient repeats a linear gradient. Radial gradient sets a radial gradient from the center out if at least two colors are defined. Repeating radial gradient repeats a radial gradient. We will go through some examples that show you how to use this code. Here is the HTML. In each section, we have a div with a unique ID attribute, so we can target that div with CSS to demonstrate different gradient options. First, we will look at a linear gradient with two colors. In each of our examples, the height of our gradient will be 500 pixels. We also set a background color as a default. If for some reason the linear gradient code is not recognized by the browser. In this case, we have set the background color to be a light gray. Now our background image is set to linear gradient with the top color being blue and the lower color being gray. And the background will transition between the two colors. Next, we will look at a linear gradient with three colors. Everything is the same except we have added yellow to be the final transition color. Next, we will repeat the linear gradient. In this case, we still have three colors, and we will explain the use of percentages. The percentages indicate how you want to transition between the colors. Next, we will look at another type of gradient, a radial gradient. Again, we set our background color to be a light gray, and in this case, our radial gradient will transition from a center blue color to gray at the edges. Next, we will add a third color to our radial gradient. In this case, the final color at the edges will be yellow. And finally, we will repeat the radial gradient. The addition of the percentages specifies the color stop points along the gradient. It is a way to customize the transition. If no position is declared, the default is to be placed halfway between the one that precedes and the one that follows. Presented by Designers Learn Code.